Hi everyone, welcome to Friday Farsight. I'm your host Sheldon Picodi, and this week we're talking about when humanity will replace plastic as our default material for so many of the things we use in daily life. This topic came from kind of a random discussion my wife and I were having at dinner one night. We just wondered, when will this happen if we know that so many things are wrong with plastic? So I got out my phone and sent off the question to the Strategic Farsight website, and the answer came back. And it was a lot more complicated than we had hoped it would be. So that's what you'll find out about shortly. I do need to drop in my disclaimer, though, that this is AI, so AI-generated prediction, AI-generated script. And so some details might have slipped through our editorial process and not be entirely correct, but we try to do our best. One thing I'll say, though, is I was quite impressed with the script generation this time with our new process. Going way back to that moment when we decided to ask the question about plastic, the thing that got us going on the topic was this notion of microplastics. So little bits of plastic being stuck all through our body, including in our brains, which is something that bothers me a little bit. So we were talking about that, generated the prediction, and it was in the database for a while, and then we generated the script. And what impressed me is our new process, which thinks about what it's going to write before it writes, zeroed in on microplastics as one of the most emotionally impactful aspects of plastic these days. And it called it body horror, and then suggested leading with it, right? So that AI thinks about the script before it writes it. And so it zeroed in right on what we cared about most when we first started talking about the topic. And so I think that's great. So with that, that's plenty of intro from me. I think we'll just hand it off to Biff and Betty. Take it away, guys.
Thanks, Sheldon. So, microplastics in human blood, in our lungs, in placentas. That's where we're starting tonight, Biff.
In placentas. So before a baby even takes its first breath, it's already got plastic in it.
That's what the research shows. A study in environmental science and technology estimated roughly 24 trillion pieces of microplastic in the world's upper oceans alone, enough to hand every person on Earth about 3 million pieces.
3 million pieces per person. That's not just making a mess, Betty. That's like a biblical plague we manufactured ourselves and then stored inside our own bodies.
And we're only beginning to understand what those fragments do once they're in living tissue. Early research points to inflammation, cellular damage, endocrine disruption. But the honest answer is, we don't fully know yet.
Which is somehow scarier than knowing. Anyway, welcome to Friday Farsight, everyone. I'm Biff.
And I'm Betty, and this week we are diving into a prediction from Strategic Farsight that, I have to say, stopped me cold. The prediction is that by around 2085, give or take 15 years, conventional petroleum-based plastic will no longer be the dominant material in manufacturing and consumer goods.
Plastic becoming obsolete. Plastic is everything. It's your phone case, your water bottle, your car dashboard, your IV tube in the hospital, the insulation in your walls, the coating inside your canned food. You're saying all of that just goes away?
Not goes away, demoted. The prediction isn't that plastic vanishes from the face of the earth, it's that it loses its crown. It goes from being the default material for almost everything to being a specialty material, used only where nothing else can do the job. And the article uses an analogy that I think is just perfect. We still use stone, right? Granite countertops, marble monuments, cobblestone lanes in old European cities, but nobody calls this the Stone Age.
Huh. So the Stone Age didn't end because we ran out of stones.
It ended because better options came along, and the prediction is that the same process will dethrone plastic. Not extinction, demotion. The age of plastic has an expiration date.
That's exactly the framing. The age of plastic, roughly 1950 to 2080, alongside the age of coal, 1800 to 1950. We are, according to this prediction, living through the twilight of an era, and most of us haven't noticed.
That hits different, Biff, because nobody thinks of plastic as a historical epoch. It's just stuff, the invisible scaffolding of modern life. And that invisibility is part of what makes this prediction so striking. Strategic Farsight rates it 8 out of 10 in significance, comparable to the end of the Bronze Age or the Industrial Revolution's pivot to steel.
Okay, but hold on, slow down. Let me earn my paycheck as the resident skeptic. Plastic is cheap. Plastic is light. Plastic is absurdly versatile. We produce 400 million metric tons of it every year. That's roughly the weight of every human being on Earth, twice over every single year. You don't just wave a wand and replace that.
No, you don't. And that's why the timeline is so long, 2085 plus or minus 15 years. This isn't next decade, but the forces pushing us away from plastic are real. They're growing and they're converging from multiple directions. Let's start with the environmental pressure.
Right, the environmental case. Everybody's seen the sea turtle in a six-pack ring. That stuff is heartbreaking, but it also feels, I don't know, familiar. We've been marinating in those images for 20 years.
It goes way beyond the familiar images, Biff. The Ellen MacArthur Foundation projected in 2016 that by 2050 there could be more plastic than fish in the ocean by weight. Now, that specific figure has been debated, but sit with the concept for a second. The ocean, where life on this planet began, the cradle of evolution, filling up with the inert byproducts of our convenience economy. A competition between the living and the non-living, and the non-living is pulling ahead.
That's grim.
And here's the number that, for me, demolishes the feel-good recycling narrative most of us carry around. Of all the plastic ever produced in human history, only 9% has been recycled.
9%? You sure about that?
9%. OECD confirmed it.
OECD...
An International Economic Policy Forum. The rest of the plastic was landfilled, incinerated, or leaked into the environment. So every time you dutifully rinse out a yogurt container and place it in the blue bin,
I'm performing a little ceremony of false hope, a recycling sacrament.
for many plastic types, that's not far off. PET bottles, your standard water bottle, soda bottle, those get recycled at decent rates in some regions, maybe 30%. But the vast majority of plastic types, the films, the multi-layer packaging, the composites, they're essentially unrecyclable in any practical sense.
So we've been living with this collective delusion about recycling for an entire generation. The little triangle of arrows on the bottom of every container, it's not a promise. It's what, a logo? An aspiration?
Mostly a resin identification code that got confused as a recycling symbol, which tells you something about how this industry has managed its public image.
Okay, so the environmental case is overwhelming. But you touched on something earlier that I want to pull on. You said environmental pressure alone has never been enough to kill off a material quickly.
History is really clear on this. Even when we know a material is poisonous, the transition takes decades. Lead in gasoline. Thomas Midgley Jr., the engineer who championed tetraethyl lead, actually got severe lead poisoning himself and had to take a leave of absence. The health risks were documented in the 1920s. Full phase-out in the U.S. didn't happen until the 1990s. 70 years of knowing it was toxic.
70 years. Lead was literally making kids dumber, and we just kept pumping it into the air for 7 decades.
And CFCs, the chemicals eating the ozone layer, decades to phase out after the hole was discovered. The pattern is consistent. You need 3 things converging: environmental urgency, viable alternatives, and economic competitiveness. All 3 legs of the stool. And for plastic, we're still constructing all 3.
But you're about to tell me we're getting closer.
Getting closer. And this is where the story gets, I think, genuinely thrilling, because the alternative materials coming out of labs and factories right now, some of them border on science fiction.
Sci-fi plastic. All right, Betty, hit me. As long as I can keep the movie rights.
Okay, first front, bioplastics and biodegradables. There's a company called Ecovative Design, producing packaging made from mycelium.
From what?
Mycelium, the root network of mushrooms. It replaces polystyrene foam, the white stuff your electronics come nestled in, grows in days using agricultural waste as its food source, and you can throw it in your backyard compost when you're done.
So, mushroom packaging? I did not have that on my bingo card for the future of civilization.
They've got partnerships with IKEA and Dell already. Next, advanced natural materials. Researchers at the University of Maryland developed a transparent wood material, actual wood, chemically treated so you can see through it, stronger than most plastics and fully biodegradable.
I'm sorry. Transparent wood? Like a window made of wood?
In principle, yeah. They remove the lignin, which is the component that blocks light, and infuse the cellulose scaffold with a transparent polymer. The structure of the wood remains, but it becomes see-through. Early stage, but the mechanical properties are impressive.
Far out. That's a nice bit of future archaeology.
Archaeology?
Oh, sorry. Just redecorating this 2080s penthouse in a novel I'm working on. Keep moving.
You want the movie rights after all?
Shh. Gotta get something out of this job.
So then there's the one that really gets my pulse going. Researchers at Berkeley Lab have developed something called PDK plastics, polydiketoenamine.
Polydiketo what now?
PDK. Here's the analogy. Conventional plastic recycling is like trying to unbake a cake. All the ingredients, the flour, the eggs, the sugar, the dyes, the flame retardants, they're fused together permanently. You can melt the cake into a blob, but you can't get your eggs back. PDK is different. You drop it in acid, and it chemically disassembles itself into its original molecular building blocks, clean monomers separated from every additive, every dye, every contaminant. And then you reform those monomers into brand new material, zero loss of quality, infinite cycles.
So it's like a cake that unbakes itself? That's genuinely wild.
It was announced in 2019 and is still scaling, but if PDK or something like it reaches commercial production, it represents a third path. Not replace plastic and not recycle plastic a bit better, but reinvent what plastic fundamentally is at the molecular level, true circularity.
Okay, that is cool. I'll give you that. But Betty, here's where the dream meets the spreadsheet. Regular plastic costs about $1,000 to $1,500 a ton. These wonderful alternatives?
2,000 to 4,000 for most bioplastics, 2 to 5 times the price.
So we're asking the entire global economy to pay double or triple for a warm feeling in its chest. That's not a business plan. That's a donation request.
It's a harder sell than that, I'll grant you. But there are specific economic forces already in motion that could close the gap, and none of them require anyone to be altruistic.
I'm listening.
First, carbon pricing. If carbon prices reach $100 to $200 per ton, which is the range the EU is actively legislating toward, plastic's cost advantage narrows dramatically. Plastic production is extremely carbon intensive because, well, you're literally turning fossil fuel into a solid consumer product. The carbon is in the plastic.
Right. You're not burning the oil, you're wearing it, eating off it, wrapping your sandwich in it.
Beckoning second, extended producer responsibility, EPR. That's a policy framework where the company that puts the packaging into the world has to pay for its end-of-life disposal. Plastic taxes, disposal fees, these could add $500 to $1,000 per ton to plastic's effective cost. The EU is already rolling these out.
So you squeeze plastic from above with policy and from below with cheaper alternatives.
And there's a third squeeze that I think is the most underappreciated. As the energy sector transitions away from petroleum, the petrochemical industry loses something it's always taken for granted, being co-located with oil refineries. See, right now, a lot of the chemical feedstocks for plastic are essentially byproducts of fuel refining. They're cheap because the refinery is already running for other reasons. When those refineries wind down because the world has moved to renewables and EVs, the feedstocks that make plastic cheap become expensive orphans.
Huh. So plastic doesn't just get beaten by better materials, it gets economically abandoned by its own parent industry.
The two transitions, energy and materials, are deeply coupled. You can't understand one without the other.
That is actually a really powerful point. I hadn't thought of it that way.
A 2020 analysis by Material Economics suggested that by 2050, alternatives could be cost competitive for 50% of current plastic applications, given sufficient policy support and R&D.
Given sufficient. There's always a caveat, Betty.
There is, and the article is disarmingly candid about this. It describes the global motivation to replace plastic as steady but not urgent. There's no Manhattan Project for mushroom packaging, no Apollo program for transparent wood. It's more like the phase-out of incandescent light bulbs.
Right, not exactly headline news. It just sort of happened.
And that's part of why the prediction gives itself such a wide window, 2085 plus or minus 15 years. The article maps out 4 phases.
Let's walk through them.
Phase 1, 2025 to 2040, the substitution phase. Single-use bags, straws, cutlery get banned across developed nations. First-generation bioplastics capture 5 to 10% of the packaging market. Recycling rates crawl up from 9 to maybe 25%, but plastic production is still growing overall, just more slowly.
So basically where we are right now, barely started.
Barely started. Phase 2, 2040 to 2060, the acceleration phase. Carbon pricing and plastic taxes make alternatives competitive for 30 to 40% of applications. Advanced materials like PDK reach commercial scale. And, Biff, the potential wild card, the health impacts of microplastics become undeniable.
That's the ticking bomb. If a major longitudinal study comes out and definitively links microplastics to, say, specific cancers or declining fertility rates, you've got your ozone hole moment, and the politics flip overnight.
The article suggests it could compress the timeline by a decade or more. Imagine 2038, a landmark study drops connecting blood microplastic levels to a cluster of cancers. The public reaction would make the CFC ban look leisurely.
There's your Manhattan Project. Not idealism, fear.
Possibly. Phase 3, 2060 to 2080, the transition phase. Alternatives dominate packaging, consumer goods, most industrial applications. Plastic is confined to specialized niches, medical devices, aerospace, chemical-resistant equipment, and the article describes a powerful social stigma against unnecessary plastic use.
Social stigma. So, like pulling out a plastic bag at a farmer's market becomes... I'm trying to think of the right comparison. It'd be like lighting a cigarette in a maternity ward.
People would stare.
They would stare.
Plastic-free becomes the baseline assumption. Using plastic requires justification. And then the final phase, 2080 to 2100, full obsolescence. Plastic is a specialty material, like titanium or tungsten. Petrochemical plants are shutting down or repurposing, and young people view what the article calls the age of plastic as a historical curiosity.
A historical curiosity. Our entire world of disposable everything. The styrofoam clamshell, the shrink wrap, the blister pack you need scissors and a prayer to open, reduced to a chapter in a history textbook.
Which brings us to the historical precedents, because material transitions are not new, and they follow surprisingly consistent timelines. Iron to steel, roughly 60 years, 1860s to 1920s. Natural fibers to synthetics, about 40 years, 1940s to 1980s. Wood to concrete and construction, 50-plus years. Even whale oil to petroleum took about 30 years, and that was driven by whales nearly going extinct.
So even when the new thing was clearly better and cheaper, it still took a generation or two.
And here's what makes plastic's situation historically unprecedented, Biff. In every one of those transitions, the replacement material was obviously superior, stronger, cheaper, more versatile. We're attempting the reverse. We're asking civilization to move away from a material that is still, by most conventional metrics, the best option on the table.
More expensive, sometimes less capable, and we're supposed to do it because it's the right thing to do.
Because of what it's doing to the oceans, the atmosphere, and increasingly to us.
And that has never been done before? An entire material transition driven by conscience rather than economics?
Not at this scale. The closest analog might be the Montreal Protocol, when the international community agreed to ban CFCs, even though they were, at the time, the best refrigerants available. Replacements were more expensive. Industry pushed back hard. And yet, it happened. The ozone layer is recovering.
But CFCs were, what, a few $1 billion of industry? Plastic is trillions.
True. And that's why the article acknowledges a muscular contrarian case. The petrochemical industry argues that the problem isn't plastic itself, it's waste management. They're pouring billions into advanced recycling, chemical recycling, pyrolysis, technologies that break plastic waste back into reusable feedstocks and into bio-based production. Researchers at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory are developing processes to make plastic from biomass or even captured CO2.
So, in that version of the future, plastic doesn't die, it shapeshifts. Same molecule, different origin story. Grown from switchgrass or pulled from the atmosphere instead of pumped from the earth.
The American Chemical Council is running a full-court press on exactly that narrative. Plastic is essential and fixable, not obsolete.
And Betty, I have to be honest, I find that more plausible than a world without plastic. This material has been adapting and surviving for 70-plus years. We keep predicting its demise, and it keeps, shape-shifting.
The article's counter is sharp. Even if bio-based circular plastics persist, if they only account for 5 to 10% of materials use versus 30% or more today, then plastic as a category has been effectively dethroned. The word obsolete doesn't mean extinct. It means no longer the default.
The demotion, not the funeral.
Exactly.
Okay, let's zoom way out. Let's say the prediction is right. It's 2085 and the age of plastic is over. What does the world actually feel like?
There are at least 3 enormous dimensions. First, economics. Trillions of dollars in petrochemical infrastructure, refineries, processing plants, pipelines become stranded assets. But new industries in bio-based materials, advanced composites, circular manufacturing rise to fill in space. Supply chains redesigned from the ground up.
Entire regions of the world that run on petrochemicals, Houston, the Gulf Coast, the Middle East, parts of China, they'd have to completely reinvent themselves.
Completely. Second, culture. Think about how deeply plastic shaped the psychology of the 20th century. The disposability it enabled, use once, throw away, didn't just change what we bought, it changed how we thought about things, about ownership, about value.
Yeah, my grandparents' generation kept everything. Darned socks, repaired radios, had one set of dishes for 40 years. Then plastic showed up and suddenly everything was temporary. Your fork, your cup, your razor, your camera, even relationships maybe. I'm not a sociologist, but I wonder sometimes if training ourselves to throw away objects made it easier to throw away other things too.
That's actually a profound observation, Beth.
Don't sound so surprised.
The prediction implies that pendulum swings back, a world where materials carry weight again, not just physical weight, but moral weight, if you want to call it that, where products are designed to last, to be repaired, to be returned to the earth or the factory at end of life.
There's something almost nostalgic about it, and also hopeful. A world where stuff matters, where your coffee mug isn't just a thing you discard when it gets stained.
And then the third dimension, what the article calls an innovation cascade. The argument is that the effort to replace plastic, learning to grow packaging from mycelium, engineering transparent wood, inventing infinitely recyclable polymers, these breakthroughs don't stay contained. They ripple outward into material science, biotechnology, manufacturing. Solving the plastic problem generates capabilities we can't yet imagine.
Like the Apollo program.
Precisely. The effort to get to the moon gave us everything from memory foam to water purification to scratch-resistant lenses.
And freeze-dried ice cream.
And freeze-dried ice cream. Totally unanticipated diffusions of knowledge.
So killing plastic births a revolution.
That's the optimistic framing, yeah.
Look, Betty, I want to believe this. I really do. But I've been reading about a lot of predictions for this show, and the ones that depend on, sustained global cooperation over decades, those make me nervous. When I look at how long it took just to get basic agreement that climate change is real, and, well, how unsteady even that is proving to be.
I hear you, but consider the convergence. Environmental crisis, regulatory momentum, technological breakthroughs, generational shifts in values, and underneath it all, the slow, inexorable decline of the fossil fuel infrastructure that makes cheap plastic possible. These aren't independent forces. They reinforce each other. And you don't need a single dramatic moment. You just need all of them pushing in the same direction year after year, decade after decade.
The slow squeeze.
The slow squeeze.
Which, for someone living through it, I've been trying to think of a metaphor for how this kind of transition happens, because it doesn't feel like a revolution exactly. And I was going down a rabbit hole on historical linguistics the other night, because that's what I do at midnight apparently, and I kept thinking, it's like how Latin became French. Nobody decided it. Nobody voted. It just drifted generation by generation. And then, one day, you look back and realize you can't read the old texts anymore. That's gone. Something new is here.
That is actually a very good analogy, Biff. It's a cultural shift that takes generations. Yet by the time a kid born today has grandchildren, plastic will be a memory of how things used to be. Strange and a little hard to fathom. Like whalebone corsets or leaded gasoline. Or, the idea that we once thought the recycling triangle on a yogurt cup actually meant something.
Ouch. All right, I think I need a week to sit with all of this.
Well, that's what Friday Farside is for. Something to turn over in your mind all week long.
Something to chew on that is not, I repeat, not made of plastic.
On that note, thank you all for listening to this week's Friday Farsight. If you want to read the full prediction article on plastic becoming obsolete as the dominant material, head to the Strategic Farsight website. It goes deep on the economics, the material science, the historical precedents. Really fascinating analysis.
It really is. Thanks for joining us, everyone. See you next Friday.
See you then.